Airport, staff kicked. John Kennedy but regretted everything when he said just one word. The morning sun hung low over Hollywood Burbank Airport, casting long shadows across the tarmac, as John Neely Kennedy stepped out of a plain black sedan. His boots hit the pavement with a soft thud, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of walk that carried the weight of years, but none of the rush. He was dressed simply dark slacks, a crisp white shirt with the top button undone and a navy coat slung over one shoulder. In his left hand, he carried an old canvas duffel bag, its edges frayed from years of use, and tucked carefully inside his coat pocket was a folded American flag, its corners precise, its fabric worn but cherished. This wasn't a trip for speeches or public appearances. This was personal. John was headed to Boise, Idaho for a private memorial for an old friend, a man who'd stood by him through thick and thin, the kind of friend who remembered your favorite coffee order even after decades apart. The memorial wasn't flashy, just a small gathering of family and close friends, but John had promised to be there to say a few words to honor a bond that time hadn't eroded. He'd said yes, without a second thought, because that's what you do for people who matter. The air was cool with a faint breeze carrying the smell of jet fuel and asphalt, and as John approached the terminal, his eyes scanned the glass doors, taking in the familiar chaos of early morning travelers, families dragging suitcases, business types tapping impatiently at their phones, and college kids with backpacks slung carelessly over one shoulder. He moved through the crowd with a quiet certainty, not drawing attention, not seeking it either. His hair, gray but still thick, caught the light as he stepped inside his face, lined with the kind of experience that didn't need to announce itself. The Phoenix Western Airlines counter was just ahead, a long line of passengers snaking around velvet ropes. John joined the queue, his duffel resting at his feet, his boarding pass and ID already in hand. He wasn't one for small talk, but he nodded politely to the woman behind him who was juggling a toddler and a diaper bag. The line moved slowly, the kind of pace that tested patience, but John didn't fidget or check his watch. He'd been through too many lines, too many airports to let it bother him. When he reached the counter, the ticket agent, a young man in his early 20s with a fresh haircut and a name tag that read Josh, barely looked up from his computer. Josh's coffee cup sat half empty on the counter, a faint ring of brown staining the paper sleeve. John slid his boarding pass and ID across the counter, a California driver's license, worn but clear, with his name printed in bold. Josh glanced at the documents, then at John, his eyes flicking over him with the kind of quick judgment that comes from seeing too many faces in a day. No greeting, no good morning, just a tap of keys and a slight frown. "You're not in the system," Josh said, his voice flat, like he was reading a script he'd memorized long ago. Tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, but steady. "Try again," he said, his tone calm, not confrontational, just precise, the kind of voice that carried weight without raising its volume. Josh sighed a small audible exhale that said he'd already decided this was a problem he didn't want to deal with. He tapped a few more keys, his fingers moving with the kind of impatience that comes from being behind schedule. "Nope, still not there," he said, finally looking up, his arms crossing over his chest. "You'll need to step aside, sir. I've got other passengers to check in." John didn't move. He stood there, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his eyes locked on Josh's. "Mind telling me why I'm not in the system?" He asked, his voice low, steady, the kind of question that wasn't a challenge but demanded an answer. Josh's jaw tightened, and he waved over a coworker, a woman with a lanyard and a clipboard, who approached with the same disinterested efficiency. "Can you check this guy's boarding pass?" Josh said, handing her the documents without looking at John. The woman whose name tag read Karen scanned the pass, then typed something into her own terminal. "He's flagged," she said after a moment, her tone as flat as Josh's. "Random review. Full recheck." Josh shrugged, like this was just another Tuesday, and turned back to John. "Yeah, you'll need to step aside, sir," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of authority, the kind that comes from knowing you've got protocol on your side. John raised one eyebrow just enough to signal he wasn't buying the dismissiveness. "Flagged for what?" He asked, his words slow, deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. Josh's arms stayed crossed, his posture stiffening. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll call security," he said, his tone sharp now, like he was ready to escalate. John gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not out of amusement, but from recognition. He'd seen this before, people wielding small power like a club, not because they needed to, but because they could. "I asked a question," he said, his voice still calm. "That's not refusing." The woman behind him, the one with the toddler, leaned over to her husband and whispered something, her eyes darting toward John. "Is that—" she started, but her husband shook his head, not sure. Josh didn't seem to notice or care. "Please move to the side." He repeated, his tone firmer now, like he was done with the conversation. John stepped aside, not because he was intimidated, but because he knew something about moments like this. He'd learned long ago that when people abuse their authority, the best response is to let them dig their own hole. He pulled another ID from his coat pocket, a veteran's card, its edges worn, the seal faded but unmistakable. He held it out, not as a flex, but as a quiet statement. Josh barely glanced at it. "ID doesn't override protocol," he said, his voice clipped like he'd rehearsed the line 100 times. John didn't argue. He just stood there, his hands back in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but unyielding, watching the system do what it did, best: grind people down under the guise of procedure. The line behind him kept moving, passengers glancing his way, some curious, some annoyed at the delay. The air in the terminal was thick with the hum of announcements, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional ding of a boarding call. John's flight to Boise was scheduled to board soon, and he could see the gate number flashing on the screen overhead, Flight 1323 on time. He thought about the memorial, about the promise he'd made to his friend's daughter, to say a few words, something simple but true, something to honor a man who'd been there when it counted. The thought grounded him, kept him steady as the situation unfolded. At that moment, 2 TSA officers approached the counter, their radios crackling softly. They didn't rush, but their pace wasn't casual either. It was that in-between stride that said they'd already made up their minds. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said, a man with a buzz cut and a badge clipped to his belt. John looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "For what?" he asked, his voice still, even still, calm. "Random screening." The officer replied, his tone clipped like he was used to saying it and not being questioned. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." John held out his boarding pass and veteran's ID again, slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "Look closer." But the officers didn't even glance at the documents. The second officer, a woman with her hair pulled back tightly, stepped forward. "Sir, we're not asking," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet threat Josh had used earlier. John's jaw tightened, not out of anger, but out of recognition. This wasn't about security. This was about judgment, about someone deciding he didn't matter because he didn't fit their idea of important. He thought about his friend, about the memorial, about the flag in his pocket, and what it meant to the family waiting in Boise. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, took a slow breath through his nose, and then followed the officers. They led him through a side door near the edge of the terminal, away from the main flow of passengers into a hallway lined with flickering fluorescent lights and gray linoleum. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale coffee, and the walls were bare except for a few faded posters about TSA regulations. A third officer met them halfway, whispering something to the others, his voice too low for John to catch the words. But he didn't need to hear them. He knew the tone self-justifying defensive the kind people use when they know they're crossing a line, but don't want to admit it. The lead officer turned to him. "We'll need to conduct a full pat-down," he said. "Your bag will be screened separately." John's eyes met his steady and unblinking. No explanation, no probable cause. He asked, his voice calm but pointed. "Just me." The officer shifted his weight, his hand resting on his radio. "Sir, you can file a complaint later," he said, dodging the question. John's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sure you say that a lot," he replied, his words cutting through the sterile air like a blade. The pat-down began methodical and cold, the kind of procedure that felt more like an assertion of control than a search for threats. John stood still, his arms outstretched as the officer's hands moved over his shoulders, down his sides, checking his pockets with mechanical precision. His boots were removed, placed on a metal table, like evidence in a crime scene. His duffel bag was opened, its contents carefully packed for the trip pawed through without care. The folded flag, still tucked in his coat, was briefly exposed, its stars catching the light, before John gently tucked it back out of sight. No one asked what it was, and he didn't offer. The officers didn't tell him what they were looking for, and that John thought was the point. This wasn't about finding something. It was about reminding him that in this moment, he was just another passenger, just another name on a screen, just another person who didn't matter. The search stretched on, minutes ticking by, the hum of the terminal fading into the background. John glanced at his watch. A simple analog with a leather strap, the hands moving past the boarding time for his flight. He didn't react, didn't protest, because he knew arguing wouldn't change the outcome. Not here, not now. The officers finished their search, stepped back, and gestured for him to collect his things. No apology, no explanation, just a curt nod toward the door. John repacked his bag, slowly folding each item with the same care he'd used when he packed it that morning. His coat was wrinkled now, his boarding pass creased from being handled. He slung the duffel over his shoulder and walked back into the terminal, the glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss. The gate screen still glowed overhead, but the status for Flight 1423 had changed, departed. He stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the screen, his mind on the promise he'd made, the one he wouldn't keep today. He pulled out his phone and typed a short message to his friend's daughter, missed the flight. "I'm sorry." He hit send, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't move, didn't sit, just stood there, his presence steady, his silence louder than any words. Around him, the terminal buzzed with life passengers rushing to gates, announcements crackling over the speakers, but for John, the world had narrowed to this moment, this loss, this quiet defiance. He wasn't angry, not yet. But something had shifted, a subtle tightening in his chest, a recognition that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated like they didn't belong. And as he stood there, a few passengers began to notice their glances, lingering, their phones tilting subtly in his direction. The story, though he didn't know it yet, was already starting to spread. John Neely Kennedy stood in the dimly lit hallway of Hollywood Burbank Airport, the fluorescent lights flickering above like a metronome marking the slow passage of time. The air was stale heavy with the scent of industrial cleaner and the faint tang of metal from the nearby security equipment. His boots, now back on his feet, felt heavier than they had an hour ago, not from wear, but from the weight of what had just unfolded. His canvas duffel bag sat on the metal table beside him, its contents still slightly disordered from the TSA officer's search, and the folded American flag in his coat pocket pressed against his chest, a quiet reminder of the promise he'd failed to keep. The officers had finished their pat-down, their hands moving with the kind of detached precision that suggested they'd done this 1,000 times before. No weapons, no contraband, no reason for the delay, just a man standing still asking questions they didn't want to answer. John's eyes, sharp and steady, followed the lead officer as he stepped back, his radio crackling softly with static. "You're free to go," the officer said, his voice flat, as if the last 20 minutes hadn't cost John a flight, a moment, a memory. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a curt gesture toward the door. John didn't move right away. He adjusted his coat, smoothing the wrinkles with slow, deliberate care, his fingers brushing the edge of the flag. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a quiet resolve that seemed to shift the air in the room. The officers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering for the first time, as if they sensed something they couldn't quite name. The hallway was narrow, lined with gray linoleum, and a single poster about prohibited items, its edges curling from neglect. John picked up his duffel, slinging it over his shoulder with the same unhurried precision he'd carried all morning. He walked toward the door, his steps measured each one, echoing faintly against the walls. The terminal beyond was a blur of motion, passengers rushing to gates, announcements droning overhead, the clatter of luggage wheels. But in this hallway, time felt suspended, as if the world outside didn't quite reach him. He thought about Boise, about the memorial, about the words he'd planned to say for his friend, a man who'd once shared a thermos of coffee with him during a long, cold night in a place neither of them wanted to remember. The promise to be there, to stand with his friend's family, had been simple, but it was the kind of promise that carried weight, the kind you didn't break lightly. And now, because of a system that saw him as a name on a screen rather than a person with a purpose, that promise was broken. John's hand tightened around the strap of his bag, not out of frustration, but from the quiet realization that this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been dismissed. Every question ignored, every moment stolen by someone hiding behind protocol. Back in the terminal, the Phoenix Western Airlines counter was still busy, the line of passengers moving steadily now. Josh, the ticket agent who'd started this chain of events, was back at his station, his fingers tapping rapidly at the keyboard, his eyes avoiding the hallway door as John emerged. The other agent, Karen, was nowhere to be seen, likely on a break, or reassigned to avoid the tension. John didn't approach the counter right away. Instead, he stood near a pillar, his gaze sweeping the terminal, taking in the faces of the people around him. A young couple arguing over a missed connection. An elderly woman struggling with her carry-on, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop. Ordinary people, ordinary lives, all navigating the same system that had just derailed his morning. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with a single notification, a reply from his friend's daughter. "We understand. Safe travels." The words were kind, but they stung not because of her, but because of what they meant. He'd let her down not by choice, but by circumstance. And that was a weight he wasn't used to carrying. As John slipped the phone back into his pocket, he noticed a young woman nearby, her phone angled subtly in his direction, her thumb hovering over the screen as if she were recording. She wasn't obvious about it, but her eyes kept darting toward him, then away, like she wasn't sure if she should approach. John didn't react. didn't acknowledge her, but he knew what was happening. He'd seen it before, the way a moment, however small, could ripple outward when someone decided to capture it. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he could guess why she was filming. Something about the scene, the officers leading him away, his calm insistence, the unfairness of it all, had caught her attention. She wasn't the only one. A man in a baseball cap near the gate was watching too, his phone held low, his expression a mix of curiosity and unease. John didn't pose or perform. He just stood there, his presence a quiet rebuke to the system that had tried to diminish him. The gate screen overhead flickered the status for Flight 1523, now a stark departed in red letters. John's eyes lingered on it for a moment, then moved to the counter where Josh was checking in another passenger, his movements quick, almost nervous. John walked over his steps, slow but purposeful, his duffel swinging lightly at his side. The line had thinned and Josh looked up as John approached, his expression shifting from indifference to something closer to unease. "Sir, I can help you rebook," Josh said quickly, his voice softer now, like he was trying to smooth over what had happened. John set his bag down and leaned slightly on the counter, his eyes locking onto Josh's. "I asked you a question earlier," he said, his voice low, steady, each word measured like a stone dropped into a still pond. "You didn't answer. You called security instead." "Why?" Josh blinked his hands, pausing over the keyboard. I thought you were being difficult," he said, his voice faltering like he hadn't expected to be called out so directly. John's eyebrow arched slightly, his expression unchanging. "Asking why my seat was changed isn't difficult," he said. "Escalating without cause is." The air around the counter seemed to thicken, the hum of the terminal fading into the background. A few passengers nearby slowed their steps, their heads turning slightly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Josh shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the side, looking for Karen or anyone else to back him up. But no one came. John didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture, didn't do anything to draw attention, but his presence was enough. It was the kind of presence that didn't need volume to command a room. "You flagged me for a random check," John continued, his tone still calm, still precise. "But it wasn't random, was it? You decided I was a problem because I asked a question. That's not protocol. That's pride." Josh's face reddened, his jaw tightening, but he didn't respond. He didn't have to. The truth was there, hanging between them, undeniable. John reached into his coat, pulling out his veteran's ID again, holding it up just long enough for Josh to see it clearly. "This means something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not because of who I am, but because of what it stands for." "You didn't even look at it." Before Josh could respond, a supervisor appeared from a side office, his lanyard swinging as he hurried over. His name tag read Mark, and his suit jacket was slightly too tight at the shoulders, giving him the look of someone trying to project authority he wasn't entirely sure he had. "Is there a problem here?" Mark asked, his voice clipped, his eyes moving between John and Josh. John turned to him, his expression unchanged. "There was a problem," he said. "Your staff turned a question into a confrontation. They ignored valid ID, delayed me without cause, and cost me a flight. That's not a problem. That's a failure." Mark blinked, clearly caught off guard, his hands fidgeting with the clipboard he'd brought with him. "Sir, I'm sure we can resolve this," he said, his tone overly conciliatory, like he was already calculating how to diffuse the situation. "We can rebook you on the next flight, first class, no charge." John shook his head just once, a small but definitive gesture. "This isn't about a seat," he said. "It's about respect. You don't fix that with an upgrade." The terminal was quieter now, or maybe it just felt that way. The passengers nearby, had stopped pretending they weren't listening. The woman with the phone was still there, her camera still angled toward John, and the man in the baseball cap had moved closer, his own phone now openly recording. John didn't acknowledge them, but he knew what was happening. The moment was no longer just his. It was theirs too. He thought about the memorial, about the flag in his pocket, about the family waiting in Boise, who'd trusted him to be there. He thought about the countless others who'd stood in lines like this, asked questions like his, and been dismissed because they didn't have a name that carried weight. "I want a name," John said, his eyes on Mark now, his voice cutting through the hum of the terminal like a blade. "The one who decided I was a problem for asking a question." Mark hesitated, his clipboard shifting in his hands. "Sir, that's a personnel matter," he said, his voice faltering. John stepped closer, not threatening, just unshakable. "Disrespect is a personal matter," he said, "and if you don't treat it like one, you're going to learn what accountability looks like." The words landed hard, not because they were loud, but because they were true. Mark's face tightened, a bead of sweat forming above his collar. Josh, still behind the counter, looked like he wanted to disappear, his hands frozen over the keyboard. The woman with the phone lowered it slightly, her eyes wide as if she'd just realized the weight of what she'd captured. The video, short but clear, was already on its way to the internet, uploaded to a platform where moments like this could spread faster than anyone could control. John didn't know it yet, but the clip, 20 seconds of him standing calm, asking for accountability, surrounded by officers who wouldn't meet his eyes, was already gaining traction, shared by strangers who saw in it something they'd felt themselves. The terminal felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier. John picked up his bag, his movements slow, deliberate, as if to say he wasn't leaving because he was defeated, but because he'd made his point. He walked toward the exit, the glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss, the morning light spilling in. Behind him, the terminal buzzed with whispers, with glances, with the faint click of phone cameras. The story was no longer just about a missed flight. It was about something bigger, something that resonated in the quiet spaces where dignity was too often overlooked. The glass doors of Hollywood Burbank Airport slid shut behind John Neely Kennedy, the soft hiss of their mechanism fading into the hum of the terminal. He stood just outside the morning air, cool against his face, his canvas duffel bag resting at his feet. The folded American flag in his coat pocket felt heavier now, not from its physical weight, but from the promise it represented, a promise he hadn't kept. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the parking lot, and the distant roar of a departing jet underscored the finality of his missed flight to Boise. John's expression was unreadable, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the city sprawled under a haze of early light. He wasn't angry, not in the way most people would expect. His was a quieter resolve, the kind that didn't need to shout to be felt. Inside the terminal, the scene he'd left behind was still unfolding, ripples spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. The video, a fleeting 20 seconds captured by a passenger's phone, had already escaped the confines of the airport, racing across social media platforms, shared and reshared by strangers who saw in it something that struck a chord. It wasn't just about John, though his name carried weight. It was about the moment, the calm, unyielding way he'd stood his ground, the way he'd asked for accountability, the way he'd refused to let disrespect slide under the guise of protocol. That moment, raw and unscripted, was now a spark igniting conversations far beyond the terminal's walls. Inside the Phoenix Western Airlines counter was quieter now, the morning rush slowing to a trickle. Josh, the ticket agent, sat in a cramped break room behind the counter, his head low, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His name tag lay discarded on the table, its pin bent from being yanked off too quickly. The supervisor, Mark, leaned against the wall, his clipboard forgotten on a chair, his suit jacket unbuttoned as if the room felt too small. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the weight of what had just happened. "You could have just answered his question," Mark said, his voice low, not accusing, but heavy with regret. Josh didn't look up. "I didn't know who he was," he muttered, his words barely audible. Mark shook his head, his arms crossing over his chest. "That's the point," he said. "You don't need to know someone's name to treat them like a person." The silence that followed was heavy, not the kind John had wielded with such precision, but the kind that comes when you realize you've made a mistake you can't undo. Josh's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if he could feel the eyes of the internet turning toward him, though he didn't yet know about the video. Mark didn't either, but he sensed something shifting, a pressure building beyond the walls of the break room. Outside, John walked toward a bench near the taxi stand, his steps slow, deliberate, the same unhurried pace he'd carried all morning. He set his bag down and sat, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the parking lot. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a steady stream of notifications he hadn't checked. He didn't need to. He could guess what they were: messages from colleagues, friends, maybe even strangers reacting to the video that was now circling online. He didn't open them, not yet. Instead, he pulled out the folded flag from his coat, holding it gently in his hands, his fingers tracing the worn edges. It was meant for his friend's family, a symbol of a bond forged in harder times, a gesture that should have been delivered in person. The thought of the memorial of the family gathered without him tightened his chest, but he didn't dwell on it. He'd learned long ago that regret was a weight you carried only if you let it define you. Instead, he thought about the bigger picture, about the countless others who'd faced moments like this, moments when they were dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than because someone with a badge or a title decided they weren't worth the effort. Back in the terminal, the video was gaining traction. The young woman who'd recorded it, a college student named Mia, had posted it with a simple caption, "This is how they treat people at Burbank Airport. He just asked a question." The clip showed John being led away by TSA officers, his posture calm but resolute, his voice steady as he asked, "For what?" The officers' responses, curt and evasive, stood in sharp contrast to his quiet dignity. Comments were pouring in, not just from locals, but from people across the country, then the world. "This happened to my dad at LAX," one wrote. "They searched him for no reason, made him miss his flight." Another, "I was pulled aside because I looked nervous. I was just tired." The stories were ordinary, unremarkable in their frequency, and that was what made them so powerful. They weren't about famous names or dramatic confrontations. They were about everyday people, everyday moments, everyday slights that added up to something bigger. A system that too often forgot the human beings it was meant to serve. In the break room, Mark's phone buzzed a text from the regional manager, "Call me. Now." He stepped outside, his face tight, already sensing the storm that was brewing. The video had reached the airline's social media team, who were scrambling to draft a response, something neutral, something that wouldn't admit fault, but would appease the growing chorus of voices online. Mark returned to the break room, his expression grim. "It's out there," he said to Josh, who looked up confused. "What is?" Mark didn't answer right away. He pulled up the video on his phone. The grainy footage playing silently, John's calm question, the officer's dismissive replies, the moment when he said, "This isn't about protocol. This is about pride." The words hit harder now, amplified by the context of 1,000 shares, 1,000 comments. Josh's face drained of color. "I didn't mean," he started, but the words trailed off. There was no defense? Not really. He'd made a choice not out of malice, but out of carelessness, and now that choice was a mirror reflecting back the consequences of his actions. John, still on the bench outside, finally checked his phone. The notifications were overwhelming, but one stood out: a message from his friend's daughter. "We saw the video. Dad would have been proud of how you handled it." The words were simple, but they landed like a balm, easing the sting of the missed memorial. He read it again, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't need the validation, but it mattered not for his ego, but for the reminder that this wasn't just about him. The video, now viewed thousands of times, was doing something he hadn't intended, but didn't regret. It was giving voice to others, to the nurse who'd been searched, without explanation, the veteran whose ID was ignored, the mother who'd been rushed through a checkpoint like an inconvenience. Their stories, small but real, were filling the comments, each one a thread in a tapestry of shared experience. John didn't see himself as a symbol, didn't want to be one, but he understood the power of a moment. He'd stood still, asked a question, and let the world see what happened when dignity was treated as optional. Inside the terminal, Mark called a quick meeting with the staff on duty. The break room was crowded now, a dozen employees squeezed around a folding table, their faces a mix of worry and defensiveness. "We need to address this," Mark said, his voice steady but strained. "The video's out there and people are talking. We can't pretend it didn't happen." Karen, the agent who'd flagged John for the random check, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "It was just protocol," she said, her tone defensive. Mark shook his head. "Protocol doesn't mean dismissing someone's question," he said. "Protocol doesn't mean escalating to security because you don't like being challenged." The room was quiet, the weight of his words settling over them. Josh, still seated at the back, said nothing, his eyes fixed on his hands. Mark continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "We deal with hundreds of people every day. Every one of them has a story, a reason for being here. We don't get to decide who matters and who doesn't." The words echoed John's earlier point, though Mark didn't say his name. The lesson was sinking in, not just for Josh, but for everyone in the room. Outside, John stood, his bag slung over his shoulder, and started toward the taxi stand. The driver, an older man with a weathered cap, recognized him immediately but didn't say anything, just opened the door with a nod. John slid into the back seat, his eyes on the airport as it receded in the distance. The terminal, with its glass facade and bustling crowds, seemed smaller now, less imposing. He thought about the memorial, about the family in Boise, about the flag he'd carry back to them another day. He thought about the video, about the stories it had unleashed, about the people who'd felt seen for the first time in a long time. He didn't want the attention, didn't want the headlines, but he understood what it meant. A single moment handled with quiet strength could do more than 1,000 arguments. It could make people stop, listen, and remember that respect wasn't something you earned with a title or a name. It was something you owed always to everyone. The lesson of the day wasn't about revenge or retribution. It wasn't even about John, though his name gave the moment weight. It was about the power of standing still, of asking a question, and refusing to be dismissed. It was about the ripple effect of one person's dignity held firm in the face of indifference, inspiring others to speak up, to share their own stories, to demand better. The video, now shared across platforms, wasn't just a record of an incident. It was a mirror reflecting back the small, everyday injustices that too many people carried in silence. And in that reflection, there was a call to action, not loud or aggressive, but clear and unshakable. Treat people like they matter, not because of who they are, but because they are. John's silence, his calm insistence, had done what shouting never could. It had made the world pause, look, and listen. As the taxi pulled away, John leaned back in the seat, his eyes on the city passing by. He didn't need to check the comments or read the shares. He didn't need to know how far the story had spread. What mattered was the lesson one he'd learned long ago and lived by. Everyday respect isn't given after recognition, it's owed from the start. And when you stand for that, when you hold your ground without raising your voice, you remind others that they can too. The stories in the comments, hundreds now, from teachers, parents, travelers, veterans, were proof of that. They weren't dramatic, weren't extraordinary, but they were real, and they mattered. John's moment had become theirs, a reminder that dignity, when held tightly, could break through even the hardest systems. And that, more than any flight or memorial, was a promise worth keeping.